Hello and welcome. Today's webinar is Exploring Data Fusion Techniques to Derive Bicycle Volumes on a Network. My name is Brendan Williams. I'm the Research Program Administrator at the Portland State University's Transportation Research and Education Center. TREC leads the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, a university transportation center funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. NITC consortium members are the University of Utah, University of Oregon, University of Arizona, University of Texas at Arlington, and the Oregon Institute of Technology. NITC's research priority is improving mobility of people and goods to build strong communities. Our presenters today are Dr. Sirisha Kothuri and Joe Broach from PSU and Dr. Kate Hyun from UTA. Sirisha is a senior research associate in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Her primary research interests are in the areas of multimodal traffic operations, bicycle and pedestrian counting, and safety. Joe is a research associate at PSU and also a senior researcher and modeler at Metro. His work focuses on transportation data, behavior, and modeling. Kate is an assistant professor in the Department of Civil Engineering. Her research centers on big data analytics using intelligent transportation systems technologies. So before I hand this over, I just want to promote our upcoming events. Our next event is a TREC Friday Transportation Seminar on March 18th from 11:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Pacific time. It's addressing gendered harassment and women's travel needs, presented by Madeline Brosen from UCLA. Our next NITC webinar is on Wednesday, April 20th from noon to 1 p.m. Pacific time. The impact of decentralizing homeless services on transportation mobility. It's presented by Sarah Canham, Evis Garcia Zambrana, Shannon Jones, and Jeff Rose from the University of Utah. The presentation today is going to be about 40 minutes long. There's a lot of material. Then we'll have about 15 minutes to answer your questions. We have a lot of attendees today, so I recommend if you have a question you want answered to submit it during the presentation. You'll have another opportunity when they do wrap up their presentation to submit your questions. And after the webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to the video recording and presentation slides. If you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. Instructions on how to redeem the credit will be included in the post-webinar email. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sirisha.
Thanks, Brendan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, let me share my screen. Can you see that okay? Yeah, okay, great. Well, thanks, Brendan. We're really excited to present the findings of this study today. And before we dive into the presentation, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge the other members of our research team, Nathan McNeil from Portland State University, Steve Mattingly and Mintu Mia from University of Texas at Arlington, and our external advisors, Krista Nodback and Frank Prue. This project was basically came about as a NITC pooled fund project. And so it was funded by NITC and a number of other agencies. And it came about because planners and decision makers have increasingly voiced a need for network-wide bicycle volume estimates. And currently, all the information that we have about bicycling activity comes either from travel surveys or from these observed bike counts, which can either be collected through automated counters or through manual short duration counts. We take the data from these counts and develop direct demand or travel demand models, but the information that those models give us is not in enough detail. And so recently we've had these third-party data sources emerge, and these are opt-in applications like Strava and or passive applications like Streetlight data that rely on location data to get us the counts, or even bike share data. And there is a lot of interest in using these applications to estimate counts because these collect data continuously and over large portions of the network. But there are still questions about how representative they are, and we also need to assess their suitability for deriving these network bicycle volumes. And therefore, that is the objective of our study. Most of the studies that have been done so far have looked at a single area or are limited in scope in terms of their comparison to counts. But our study, we wanted to conduct a more robust analysis and look at these emerging data sources and study them for factors such as accuracy, coverage, completeness, and representativeness. We also wanted to explore how we can combine these data sources along with conventional data sources to estimate bicycle volumes. And the methods that we are looking at include different model forms and estimates and data fusion techniques. And finally, the all-important question is what marginal value do these different data sources and forms add in predicting bicycle volumes? And we hope to answer these questions today. So in order to achieve our stated objectives, we needed to select some sites. And we wanted to select sites that were geographically dispersed. We also focused on sites that had these multiple data sources that we were looking to evaluate, as well as had robust count data, because these counts are our ground truth. So we ended up selecting 6 sites across the country for evaluation. Boulder, Charlotte, and Dallas formed our basic sites where we looked at data for 1 year, that is 2019. And the 3 sites in Oregon, Bend, Eugene, and Portland, formed our enhanced sites where we evaluated data for 3 years between 2017 and 2019. The idea being that we wanted to look at the temporal stability of these data sources. So how are these data sources varying over years, as well as explore some transferability of the models across the years. And you'll hear more about those two a little later on in the presentation. This slide here is basically showing the overview of our data processing steps. And as you can imagine, we had a number of data sources that we had to work with and in multiple different formats and standards. So this task was a pretty huge and challenging task and took a lot longer than what we were expecting. So I'll just go over each of these data sources in a little bit more detail. Our count locations, these are our ground truth data. And so we had 603 count locations across the 3 years, as you can see, spread across the 6 sites that we had selected. We had 2 different types of counts. The permanent counts were from these automated counters, and we had 2 different types of these counts that we classified. We considered permanent counts to be full year counts if they had 10 or more months of valid data. If a counter had less than 10 months of valid data, we called it less than full year and treated that as a short duration count. For the short duration counts themselves, we considered only those counts which were collected for at least 24 hours or more, because previous studies have shown that using 2-hour count data can lead to large errors in estimation. The permanent counts, this chart here shows the counters available for 2019 across the 6 different cities. And we did have some challenges in accessing this data, standardizing this data because it came in different formats. A lot of this data was not validated, so that's something to keep in mind. Some of the agencies do have their automated cleaning and flagging process, but we also implemented our own QA/QC process so that it is standard across all the data sets. We did perform a manual review of the and flagged some small amount of data. And again, just as a reminder, we used the permanent counts as those data from those counters that had 10 or more valid months of data. One other important thing to note from this chart here is the uptime of these counters. So for example, in Portland, we had 13 counters in 2019 that were available. However, only 4 of them had data for 10 or more months in the year. And so uptime of these counters is something to keep track of. And overall, in our data set for 2019, while we had 90 counters, we lost 1/3 of them because they did not have data for more than 10 or more months. For the short duration counts, as I mentioned previously, we only included counts that were collected for 24 or more hours. The highlighted column here shows the counts that were collected between 1 week to less than 1 month. And this was particularly the case in Bend and Eugene, where they had these automated counters that they would rotate around the network, which allowed them to collect data for longer periods of time. So overall, we had 471 short duration count locations. I just want to talk a little bit about the Strava and Streetlight and bike share data that we used in this study. So the Strava data that we got was in 2019, and so this was before the Strava data was available for free. So there might be some enhancements with the data that's available right now. But one of our first steps was to match the Strava counts, which were available with the underlying OpenStreetMap format, to our count sites. And we encountered a couple of issues while doing this in a few locations. On the left figure here, the green diamond is where our count site is. And there are 3 different links here. The one on the far left is a pedestrian facility. The one in the middle is a bicycle facility, and the one on the far right is the motor vehicle lanes. So the numbers in the parentheses here are the Strava counts. And as you can see, these counts are matched to the different facilities, whereas in reality, we would only most likely see cyclists on the bicycle facility itself. And so in these cases, we went ahead and corrected these map matching issues wherever we saw them. Another issue we noted was is shown in this figure on the right here. So again, the green diamonds are our count sites. There's bicycle facilities on either side here. And however, from the Strava network, we only got counts as a center line. So we are missing that level of detail here. And so we are not able to look at the directionality of the bicycle counts itself. So we tried to correct these issues that we saw as much as possible. And the other thing that we did note is the Strava data are masked and rounded up. So we tried to use the hourly data So any counts less than 3 on the hourly side are not available, and counts are also rounded up to the nearest 5. And therefore, to minimize these errors, that we shifted to using the monthly base data. We also had good availability at the permanent count sites with the Strava data itself. The Streetlight data is available from their web platform as their index data. But after consultations with them, and since we wanted to minimize any sources of error in our modeling framework, we decided to use their raw data, so which is not adjusted. And this was available on request. And getting the Streetlight data from the web platform is a little bit more of an involved process. We had to manually draw these gates here across the links of interest and do this for all the count sites that we had to get this data. And we also had, in general, good coverage of the Streetlight data across the sites that we were looking for. And finally, bike share data was available in 2 formats, and it was only available for the Oregon sites. The bike share was available as GPS latitude, longitudes along the route in Eugene and Bend. And for the Portland sites, it was only available at the start and end of the trip. So we had latitudes and longitudes at the origins and destinations. And for each of these locations, we created both Euclidean and network buffers, and then we estimated these 4 variables within these buffers. We looked at bike share origins, destinations. We looked at number of crossings as well as bike share routes. And finally, the static data. These are contextual data that we use along with these emerging data sources in our models. And we use the network, socio-demographic, and weather data. And we ended up standardizing this data because we wanted to have the same set across the 6 different locations. And so we used OpenStreetMaps and NHGIS to gather some of this data. So with that, I will turn it over to Joe to walk us through the modeling framework and some results.
Thanks, Sirisha, and thanks everyone for being here. I want to start the overview of this kind of complex modeling process by getting you to think like our model was trying to think, and imagine a location in your community and a line of cyclists coming by, and some fraction of those cyclists might be logging their trips via the Strava app. That would be our Strava data. Another fraction of the cyclists, whether they know it or not, are logging their location through weather apps or mapping apps. This is the data that Streetlight uses to then try to pull out which of those GPS traces, those phone traces, are bicycle trips, and then collects that data. If we knew the fraction of Strava users or Streetlight users to the total number of cyclists, then we're set, the problem is solved. Unfortunately, from past work and from our own looks at this data, we know that that fraction of cyclists captured in the data varies a lot across time, by location, across region. And so our goal, our primary goal with the modeling, was to try in a given context to predict what that fraction of cyclists might be, and then be able to factor up to an annual average number of cyclists at a location network-wide. Go to the next slide. And so I'm going to present to you part of our modeling work, and I'm going to hand it off to UTA to present an extension of that work. But I want you to understand how we kind of divided up the data. So we split the data into several dimensions to get better answers to our research questions. One dimension, as Sirisha said, is our confidence in the ground truth or the count data. So we divided the data up into those sites where we had more or less complete years of data and those where we didn't. We also divided by year because we know that these patterns can change from year to year. So we only had the earlier years at the Oregon locations. And we also tested pooled models, both all the cities and Oregon pooled model, as well as city specific models. So many dimensions, all in all, it's over 100 model permutations that we tested to kind of answer this overarching question of what value do you get out of each data source, and related to that, how good are the predictions of the number of cyclists from these data sources. We also looked at an extension to more conventional modeling techniques using machine learning methods, and that's what Kate and crew are going to talk about right after this. But for now, I'm going to give you a kind of high-level overview of what's covered in much more detail in the report. And I encourage you to take a deeper look at that when it comes out soon. Next slide. In addition to those splits of the data that I just mentioned, for each of those kind of cuts of data, we looked at 7 different model forms, which are just combinations of our different data sources to get at which one is contributing more or less, and how do they work together to give us a better prediction of the number of cyclists at a site. And those 3 data types that we're talking about are the static contextual variables at the location, the Strava counts, and the Streetlight counts. And all of these were modeled as ADBT, or the annual average daily bicycle traffic at a location. So that one average over a year, that's very important in planning and many other application contexts. Next slide. For those of you who have interest in model specification, much more detail again in the report, but it was a Poisson count model with robust standard errors. And I think more importantly, to kind of get a high-level grasp on, is we did it as a cross-validation exercise. And what that amounts to is we estimate the model many times, and in each case we leave out a portion of the data, different portions of the data, to see how the model does with data that it hasn't had access to yet, because that's more important for application than how well it can parse out a fixed static data set. So all of the statistics that I'm going to be presenting to you is how the model did against the data that it hadn't seen, against locations that it weren't involved in the estimation. The next slide. And I'm going to give you a high-level view of the results again. If you're interested in the details, and I hope you are, for specific models, it's all covered in the report. I can't possibly do that for 100 models here, but we saw a lot of consistent patterns that I think we can talk about. So Sirisha mentioned those static variables. I just want to kind of remind you what went into the different models without going into the detail here. We had variables that were measured at a specific location. So at that link, was there a separated bike facility or not? We had variables that were summing up or summarizing within a half mile and a 1 mile radius, just straight line, crow fly distance. Also some variables that were measuring along the network at different distances, although only the 2 mile distance ended up showing up in the final models. And then we also measured some things as a straight line distance. So distance to the nearest water body, or in some of the models I'll show you later, of some other features. These variables varied within the models, although we tried to keep the set of variables as consistent as we could to evaluate the different data sources. We were limited in the sample. You see those sample sizes at the top, 60 total, and 23 in Dallas, the city with the most full year permanent count data. And so we couldn't disaggregate some of the variables in the way we would hope to. So you notice those in the red boxes. For example, we didn't have enough counts on both primary and secondary arterial streets to really distinguish the differences in the two. The same with some features like the distance to water body here, which we couldn't tease out of the pooled model, but could in the city specific example. Next slide. So I also want to just, before we go into the slides, I'm going to summarize a lot of the model using these two very common statistics that have big names, but fairly simple interpretations. The percent root mean squared error is kind of our best all-in-one model performance stat. lower is better. And this is what we used as we went through our model selection process. It gives a good sense of how much of the variation in bicycling activity is captured by the model. And then a statistic that maybe is a little bit easier to interpret on the fly is the mean absolute percent error. So what is our expectation of how large the errors are going to be at a specific location from our model? The problem with MAPE as an overall summary is that it only makes sense across sites with sort of similar base level ADBT values. Low volume sites will have high errors. So if you have a site with 10 cyclists a day and you predict 20, that's a 100% error rate, right? Even though it's only an error of 10 bikes. So we present those only in volume bins. And we can go to the next slide. One back, yeah. So it's a big table, but it's divided into 3 pieces, and that is where the pattern really fell that we think is most important from looking at this data. Those first 3 columns show the models that include only one of our 3 data sources alone. So either the static variables, just the Strava, or just the Streetlight data. Those, in all cases, did not perform as well as combining pairs of variables. So combining Strava and Streetlight, static and Strava, static and Streetlight. The variable sets were complementary to various degrees. And then the very best performance came by combining all 3 sets of variables. So I think one big takeaway is, the more of these data sources that you can fuse together, the better your models and your accuracy and prediction is going to be. So they all kind of contribute some independent information to understanding how many cyclists are likely to be at a given location. I will point out that in the Dallas model, we saw a slightly different pattern in that the two proprietary data sources, the Strava and Streetlight data, when combined, performed about as well as in combination with the static variable. So that was the one case where we saw these emerging data sources maybe being, I don't want to say enough on their own, but just as good on their own as combining with our more traditional measures of context to predict cycling. Next slide. And so I'm actually going to roll this into the full takeaways because they really agreed with each other quite well. And in the interest of time, we'll skip this slide for now, but leave it here for posterity. If we'll go to the next one, yeah. And so what I'm going to do now is present similar results, but this time for our full set of counters. So those with a full year of data and those that we factored up into annual averages from the shorter duration counts. Using methods described again, much more detail in the report. And so here now we have 3 sets of models, the pooled model with all the cities. We tested a regionally pooled model with the idea that this might be an intermediate possibility. Many cities don't have a large enough count program to do something like this just locally, but maybe if you could pool cities across a region, you might be able to get to something a little better. And then we had city-specific models. Even though the samples in some cities got a little small, we were able to estimate models for all of them individually. And some variables are highlighted here that were different from the full year of data. So you notice that with the broader range, these 311 locations, we were able to disaggregate the variables a little more. So rather than just a separated bike facility, we actually distinguished between an off-street path and an on-street cycleway. We were able to, again, break down those functional roadway classes a little more. Instead of just arterial, we looked at primary, secondary, tertiary, add socio-demographics, et cetera. You'll also notice that when you move to the right here, you're getting to more locally specific models. You start pulling in more local contextual variables, places that count bikes on footways or what are primarily sidewalks, and then the impact of, say, major universities in a given locale that we couldn't pick up in the pooled model. So one of the advantages of doing it locally. Next slide. So again, with the full set of count locations, we really saw a similar pattern to the results as we saw with with the full year sites. And I'll take you through that with this graphs. In the along the x-axis are different models. So each city-specific model, the Oregon pooled model, and the all-city model. And if you look at those first three bars in each case, those are the single variables alone. And in almost all cases, the error, the height of those bars is higher than the bars to the right of them. So as you add combinations of variables, you do a better job at predicting the outcome. So when you combine the local context with Strava to adjust those Strava counts, or with Streetlight, do a better job. The purple bar on the far right of each of the sub-models is the combination of all three sets of variables, static, Strava, and Streetlight. And in most cases, it is the best performing, lowest error rates. Although you will notice if you kind of squint at that dark orange bar, sort of two over to the left of the purple, we saw, the static plus Strava model performed about as well in most cases, and in one case even slightly better than the full set of variables. So this is where we started to see Strava maybe outperform Streetlight to some extent in terms of providing information and complementary information to the local context variables. I also highlighted two cases that are kind of the exceptions that prove the rule in a sense. So in Boulder and Dallas, we saw slightly different patterns. We already talked about the Dallas pattern where Strava and Streetlight together seem to be enough, doing well without local context adjustment. In Boulder here, this is something slightly new. So that in Boulder was a case where, although the Streetlight data performed better on its own, that's that blue bar 3N versus the second bar, the light orange bar, which is Strava only. When combined with the static variable, Streetlight did not perform as well. So in this case, you were actually better off going with just Strava and with the static adjustment and leaving Streetlight out. It was actually slightly worse when you put all three together, but that was the only case that was true. So more or less a repeat of the patterns we saw with the full counter set. That the consistency was kind of heartening, that we felt like we were moving in one direction, with a few little nuances to mention. Now in these next slides, I want to kind of focus in on some of the other lessons that we learned and kind of, if not answers, the beginning of answers to some of our questions. Those of you with sharp eyes were probably already noticing that the city-specific models tended to perform better than the pooled models. That's to some extent to be expected, but was nice to see. And here you see it even more clearly, that if you look at the bars, especially those higher volume locations, they're doing a better job with the city-specific models than the pool. What you'll also notice, of course, is the big difference in performance by the type of site it is. Is it a low, mid, or high bike volume site? So at those low volume sites, and that's something like less than 100, around 100 or fewer cyclists per day on average through the year, the error rates at this point with these methods are going to be high, typically 100% or more. So that if you had a site with about 50 cyclists a day, you would expect the model, you wouldn't be surprised to have the model predict 100 or even more. As we move to the kind of mid and higher volume locations, so those with more than 100 roughly, or more than 350 or 400 cyclists per day, the error rates come down dramatically, and you start to see error rates at the mid-volume sites around 40% on average, down to getting to 30% and below for the highest volume sites. And so, depending on the application and the context, these different error rates may be more or less acceptable. And it really comes down to what you're wanting to do with the data. But it's important to kind of keep in mind that at those low volume sites, that you're going to see pretty high error rates most likely. Next slide. We can quantify, we can look at the pooled model performance in individual cities versus the city-specific performance to kind of quantify what you're giving up if you can't model locally. And in all cases, the city-specific models outperform the others, sometimes by a fairly large margin. The results were more mixed for the regional pooled model. The jury is still out on whether that's a better way to go rather than pooling with a larger number of cities from a broader area. But we know from experience that it's sometimes easier to conduct projects within a single state, can be led by a DOT. So we wanted to test it. But in Eugene, it did improve the performance over the all-city pool model. In the other two locations, it was kind of a wash. So not sure if the regional option is a good one, but if possible, city-specific will get you the best performance. And next slide. The other thing that's important is going back to that initial idea is you can't hold the fraction, you can't hold the fraction constant for the Strava and Streetlight data. It's going to result in much higher error rates. And I just wanted to make this clear about what the model, what it means by adjusting Strava and Streetlight counts, or that factor, the fraction of cyclists that they're capturing. So the blue line here would represent just assuming a single fixed rate across all the locations, which worked out to be about 13 actual cyclists per Strava count, for instance. What the model is able to do is shift that fraction around. You see the shifts in the three curves about whether it's on an arterial versus a non-arterial. In the highest bar there is where there's a lot of bike commuting activity around. There, Strava is capturing less of the traffic according to the model. And then you also see the kind of slope of that curve where close in to the core of a city, one Strava cyclist is probably accounting for many more actual cyclists. It's capturing a smaller fraction of the traffic than as you move away from the city, which strikes us as logical, right? As you get out, these trips they're more likely to be exercise, recreational focused trips where Strava has a higher market share. So what do you get from adjusting? The next slide kind of quantifies for that. On the average, you're going to get about 1.4 times the error if you don't adjust that fraction from place to place, and up to as high as 240%, 3.4 times the error rate. So this is the difference between just using Strava alone or just Streetlight alone versus adjusting it with those static variables or in combination with each other. So it's worth it to gather the additional data sources and not just assume a single factor as we sort of knew was true, but wanted to quantify. Next slide. The other thing is, can we do this exercise once and then transfer the model from year to year? And we tested that by applying our 2019 models to our 2018 data. Again, we only had that data in Oregon going back to the previous years, without re-estimating the model. So if you blindly applied it versus allowing it to recalibrate to a different year when those factors might change. If you re-estimate but kept the model form the same, that's that first set in the red box there. The error rates were just what we would have expected, basically, very similar to the ones that we saw when we estimated the same year, which is a good, that's a good thing that we saw what we expected. Without re-estimating, the error rates climbed considerably, from anywhere from 15 to 50% increase in error by just dragging those along 1 year. We weren't able to test, we didn't have the data to support what if you go 2 years off, but the expectation is those error rates would probably continue to increase. On average, you could expect about a 30% increase in error from not re-estimating your model yearly. So there's unfortunately ongoing work to be done even after you access and do the data once, but you can, it seems, port the model form from year to year, which is nice. Next slide. So some takeaways from the count modeling, and then I'm going to hand it over to talk a little about the machine learning before we have some Q&A. I think you've heard this already, but I'll just repeat that. I think both of the emerging data sources, Strava and Streetlight, seem to provide really useful information on bike activity, but they need context adjustment to kind of reach their full potential at this stage. Neither one of them is just plug and play for getting annual bike volumes. With a few exceptions, you're best off combining as many data sources as you can. If you were restricted to 2, the Strava adjusted with the static contextual variables would be the way to go. Whereas the Streetlight improvement was more marginal in most cases, although it did show promise in specific locations. And to skip the buffer analysis, I think we've discussed that already. There are definitely gains to estimating more local models, but we know that's not always possible. Count programs are costly and difficult to maintain. If the pooled models were not, they were still useful. They didn't just fly off the rails. You just are going to have to accept that the error is going to be a bit higher if you pool your data with another region to figure this out. Finally, the statistical model fit was generally really good. And it tells us that we could try to tweak these models and data even more than we already have, which is a lot. But really, there might not be much more to wring out with our current data, methods, and count programs. I think that, as we'll discuss at the end, one of the biggest things we can do is just get more on-the-ground count data at a broader range of locations to understand these factors. This was also supported by FHWA's recent validation of Streetlight for motor vehicle counts. When you compare like for like at similar volume levels, our results were very similar to what they were finding on the motor vehicle side, trying to use Streetlight to predict AADT. And so I think, we're kind of where we are. I don't, there's a lot more to do. That said, I'm going to hand it over to Kate, and the one promising direction to go is to get away from these just traditional count models to a more flexible model form that maybe can make more sense of these complicated interactions and do so with less modeling effort or less analyst intervention, and make it more transferable from place to place. So I'll hand it over to Kate and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, so our last modeling exercise is to use a little bit more advanced modeling form using some of the machine learning algorithm. And we are using the same data sets and the same data fusion as Joe walked you through to the count models. So the machine learning, it is important to have sufficient number of data to have the model develop and apply the model. So what we use as the data is the permanent count and short duration combined. And we were able to develop a city-specific model for Portland and Eugene because these 2 locations, we have enough data to be able to develop the machine learning algorithms. The data fusion structure is very similar to count model. We use different types of data fusion to understand the performance of the data fusion we bring into the AADBT predictions. So the last model, the ML5, is the complete form where we have all of these Strava, Streetlight, static, and also the bike share data all together. We tried different types of modeling form, including random forest, XGBoost, decision tree, and many more algorithms. And we found that the random forest produced the best performance. So from these slides, we are going to just focus on the result from the random forest. So the overall performance, same as the count model, we are presenting percent RMSE by different types of locations and also the data fusions. So when we have all city pooled model, we are seeing a different performance by the data fusions. And the best performance was obtained when we have static, Streetlight, and Strava all together. You're seeing here, similar to the count model, the Portland, the city-specific model or the Eugene-specific model has produced a better performance than the other city or the Oregon pooled model. Next slide. Okay, so we are also wanting to compare this performance by volume bin. And we divide by, here this slide, we are showing the low and high volume. So the low volume, similar to count model, we have somewhere between 0 to 50 or even 100 for the Portland cases. And what we are seeing here is much higher percent RMSE, the error, regardless of the data fusion, the combinations. The high volume side, where we have more than 100 or even 300 data points for the Portland, we are seeing much lower error rates in here. And if you see the second right column, the static Streetlight and Strava all together, you're also seeing the best performing modeling RMSE over there. What we also wanted to make sure is that whether we have under or overestimation in some specific locations. What we found in here is basically we see a balanced under or overestimated value, and it's not really biased towards the over or underestimated. So for example, the Portland side, we're seeing that some are overestimated, some are underestimated, not really specifically biased towards one direction or the other. And the pattern actually stays the same for all of the locations. Well, one of the most interesting comparison would be this slide, the comparison to the count model. So here we have 4 different study areas, the all-city pool, Oregon pool, Portland, and Eugene, the city-specific model. The first row is showing the performance from the count model. And then the second one is the random forest, which is our best performing machine learning models. So you can see here, we do see very comparable performance here, regardless of the data fusion, but you might see that for the city-specific, the Oregon pooled or all-city pooled model, the count model slightly performed well over the random forest, but the Eugene, we see the random forest is slightly working better than the count model when we have Streetlight and Strava. But if we add the static variable, again, the performance were very similar and produce very comparable results between the count model and random forest. Okay, so conclusion and recommendation, where there's some key takeaways, and we categorize by the topic, different topics. The first key takeaway about the counts. Well, counts are the most important variable to develop a data, to validate the big data sources, but we found it is somewhat challenging to access and standardize the count data, whether the permanent count sites or the short-term duration sites. We gather data from multiple cities, so the different formats was challenging for us to get the data in time, and also the delayed access. For the permanent count site, the poor uptime was also challenging. Some of the challenge that we encounter when we gather the data sets. The bigger actually challenge was the lack of variety in permanent count sites because it limits the model development. We were not able to capture diverse characteristics, local context, where we only have permanent count location on the high volume corridors. So we actually used a short-term duration to expand the ability to capture those geographical variations. However, still, this was one of the biggest challenges that we encountered. The modeling, what we found is the emerging data source definitely helped and fill the gap in the local contextual, giving a more local contextual data. So the best model was found when we used the static Strava and Streetlight all together for both count model and machine learning models. We also found that the locally calibrated and locally developed models performed better than pooled models. But the models were transferred well within the same region. The machine learning approaches produce similar performances. Well, typically we are expecting advanced form of modeling working better. However, what we have as a challenge here is we deal with the small amount of data. So machine learning model was not able to be developed in the full capacity of its function because we had to rely on the small sets of data to understand the complex pattern and have the machine learning work to perform in any type of data fusions. Some recommendations in here, we recommend to install more permanent counters because we obviously need more counts to develop model. Especially what we have challenging in it was the lower volume locations and also the on-street locations. We see more variation in such lower volume location, however, limited number of counters also limits our ability to understand the pattern between the variables and predict the AADBT. Short duration counts definitely fill the gap, but we also have to keep in mind that the short duration counts intrudes additional error when we factor up to get the AADBT. Standardization and automation was the problem. So we recommend to standardize and automate the count, the store and process the data. And also emerging data source, we encountered a similar problem. So we recommend to make more robust, organized, and accessible local count data for the emerging sources as well. Well, almost a similar discussion going on here, but the third plan, I like to have your attention for the third bullet points. We recommend re-estimate model parameters when we are wanting to transfer to model in a different year or different locations. Okay, so I think that's the last slide. So I'll hand over to Sirisha, the next steps.
Thanks, Kate. And I think we are significantly over time. So want to make sure we leave some time for Q&A. So just leave it here just to say that, our next steps are to circle back. The reason we started this is we want to expand it to the network. And so this, what you're seeing here is our initial effort to using the models we developed to predicting bicycle volumes across the network. So I'll leave it there for now, and let's just open it up for questions.
Yeah, thanks. So I was warned that this should be a 2-hour presentation, so it's no surprise that we're running out of time. So I just want to ask the presenters who can also see the Q&A if there's any of these questions they want to specifically answer. I think we have more than enough.
Yeah, I think Lindell's question, I think, was a good one on the Strava, the bias in the Strava user base that maybe could tackle. So yes, it's well known that Strava has a somewhat biased user base. They're much more likely to be male and more likely to be sort of middle-aged, and although we don't have exact figures, are more likely to be sort of avid and recreational cyclists. And so how the models attempted to capture this was by taking adjusting the Strava counts by those contextual factors. So as an example, in higher income areas, we sort of adjusted that Strava fraction down, or the Strava multiplier was lower in those higher income locations, probably because the participation rate was higher there. And the same for certain types of facilities that were more exercise focused would get adjusted down by the model. So yes, that is one of the key challenges to just using the Strava data directly. That's their big challenge, is we don't know the representatives of their bike user base, and it changes from place to place. So thank you for the question.
Joe, there is another question about Streetlight data. So Streetlight categorizes trips primarily based on speed. It's known to miscode trips in urban areas and assign some bus and vehicular trips to bicyclists due to lower speeds. Have you looked into this issue, or did you use Streetlight data at face value?
Yeah, we did use it at face value. We've discussed this with them, and we've pointed out some sites where it seems pretty clear that that's happening. As an example, we have a couple of count locations on bridge decks in Portland that are shared with the Max light rail, so high capacity transit alongside at low speeds. And yeah, it's the predictably overestimating bicycle trips there. So no, we didn't adjust, we didn't fix their errors for them, but we were aware and kind of went back and forth some. We also saw potentially the reverse of that happening, although we're not positive, but we were looking at a location which has very high volumes of cyclists next to low capacity roadway and transit. and it was actually under, the streetlight counts were under what we would expect. And so it actually seems like there might have been some mischaracterization going the other direction. They were imputing some of those cycling trips into transit and auto modes, where it was the street where I think the cycling volumes might be higher than either of the other two. So yeah, a great question and a good point. So Strava's challenge is the bias in their user base. Streetlight's big challenge is they just get raw GPS traces. They don't even start from knowing that it's a bike trip. So they have an extra challenge there. It's going to vary from place to place. Thanks for the question.
There's a question from Carl about the 24 hours to 1 week count. So the sort of the counts that we encountered in Bend and Eugene. And since these were captured on automated devices, were they all on off-street paths or bike facilities versus counts of bikes and mixed traffic? So were there many counts used in this study that captured activity on non-bike facility streets?
And the answer is surprisingly yes. And part of that is due to Bend's unique count program, where they purposefully move the eco counters around. So there's not a full year data because they move them every month or 2 months or something like that. And those captured a lot of roadway mixed traffic locations. All in all, though, I want to say, I think it's in the report, but I think close to half the sites were on a mixed traffic on road facility, with the caveat that a number of those in Portland were actually Bicycle Boulevard, Neighborhood Greenway, which are mixed traffic but bike priority streets. So, but yeah, no striped bike lane or separated infrastructure on a lot of those.
For Portland, so most of the counters are on residential road, and for like overall, we found like most of the counters in 2019 are on secondary and tertiary roads, and big amount of like counters are on residential, residential and cycleway.
Yeah, sorry, I lost track of like which questions were answered and which weren't.
No, I just add some additional information, the counter locations based on voice and classification.
Okay, I don't know. Let's see. Did the study include counts at roundabout sites? I wonder how the accuracy differed for roundabouts versus intersections versus linear segments. I don't think we had any roundabout sites as far as we are aware, but it would be interesting to look at that.
We might have had a handful in Eugene, but they were all counted on like on an entering leg or something. So it wasn't counting the full intersection or anything. So it was a little simpler.
There's another question about the reliability of short duration versus permanent counts. And have we looked into the reliability of both? So I think we did some initial work in terms of reliability to look at the uptime for the permanent counts, and noticed that a number of them were not collecting data for the entire year. The reliability of the short duration counts it's a little bit harder because the count locations keep moving. So yeah, I think definitely one key takeaway was to maintain the permanent counters and definitely use resources to do that, so that you're getting that data over the years. We did have in the model certain locations that had data for 1 year but did not have data for next year, so there were some issues with reliability there. Brendan, I don't know do we need to end now, or are we?
Maybe we could just go back to sort of talking about your sort of stakeholders, and you mentioned you had a presentation that was a lot longer to the TAC, and I saw the last slide about developing it for the network. Can you just sort of make a statement about how everything could be going forward?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, yeah, our next steps are to continue the exploration to expand this out to the network. We're looking at our different sites, model forms. This can be computationally challenging, and so we are going to look into this some more. And to just end this, just wanted to thank NITC and all the agencies for funding this work. This is a huge effort. And we'd like to thank our TAC. There are a number of members that were involved and provided great suggestions. And this was a long project. And thanks go especially out to Josh Roll, who was our chair, for staying involved and keeping us going. So thanks for that. We also want to thank a number of people at the different agencies for providing us the data, without which, this research would not have been possible. And of course, the folks at Strava, Metro, and Streetlight data as well. So thank you.
Yeah, and so I'll just make a mention that we have the report, and we will be publishing it this month on our NITC website under this project. So please, if you're interested, if you have some curiosity about it, feel free to download it. And if you have questions, you can contact us with those. And like I said in the beginning, we have other webinars and Friday transportation seminars coming up. And so I encourage you to keep attending and let us know through the surveys how we've done and what you'd like to see. So yeah, we appreciate that. Do any of you have anything more to say before we log off?
No, thank you.
All right, great. So yeah, this Kate, you did one of these webinars recently, and I know you and Sirisha are still working on another NITC project. So hopefully we'll have you back sometime soon. So thank you, Joe.